Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are. My name is Aisha Chalar. I am a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and I'm a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Vienna. Our team at Seminar Series today is composed of Clemens Schmidt, who is giving us the technical assistance, and Anuj Govich, a PhD student in anthropology, who is the coordinator of the Seminar Series. We want to welcome you to our second event this April of the Seminar Series on forced migration. This time we welcome Professor Greg Feldman from University of Windsor, who will be giving a presentation titled The Migrant, quote unquote migrant in the middle, how the struggle for decolonization and the struggle against fascism are linked. As you gather from the title, it is tackling very timely, very current debates going on within anthropology, but not only in anthropology, in several disciplines. For those of you who are new to the seminar series, let me give you a little bit information about the series. The seminar series on forced migration is part of Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration at the Institute, anchored at the Institute for Human Sciences and Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group. And they are hosted at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna. This research platform on forced migration aims to advance the cooperation between European and South Asian institutions and academics, while working towards creating a joint research platform for innovative knowledge production on forced migration and bordering regimes, bringing together scholars, policymakers, and practitioners from different disciplines and regions. The seminar series aspires to decentering, above all, the Europe-focused scholarship, debates, and policies on forced migration. Unfortunately, the state of the world actually encourages us more and more to this kind of comparative research, which will decenter or aims to decenter Europe-centered centered scholarship and knowledge production, especially on migration. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to remind you that the seminar is being recorded, and we will have a question and answer session after the presentation, but please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and we will read the questions during the discussion. I cannot promise that that will be in the exact order, because sometimes, depending on time, that we have to gather some of the questions. Our speaker today is Gregory Feldman, who is an associate professor at the Political Science Department at the University of Windsor in Canada. But Gregory Feldman is an anthropologist by training, and his work is a very anthropological work, but crosses various disciplinary fields. So he's a political anthropologist interested in critical perspectives on sovereignty, migration, security, and technocracy, with geographic interests in Europe, North America, and Africa. His most recent publications include a book published in 2019 called Gray Zone: Sovereignty, Human Smuggling, and Undercover Police Investigation in Europe, which came out from Stanford University Press. And in 2015, We Are All Migrants: Political Action and the Ubiquitous Condition of Migranthood, which also came from Stanford University Press. And also Gregory Feldman is well known with his conceptual and empirical work on the migration apparatus in Europe. His 2011, The Migration Apparatus, Security, Labor, and Policy Making in the European Union had been an agenda-setting work for several migration scholars. Among the participants, I noticed that there are some students of mine who are very well versed in your work, Greg, in the classes. In addition to these books, Professor Feldman has also, of course, published articles on a variety of journals, which I would not go over, but I will just name some of the titles of some of the journals, like Comparative Studies in Society and History, Social Anthropology, and Anthropological Theory, among the others. Currently, he's involved in 3 different projects. First focuses on political activism among Congolese refugees in Canada. The second one is a book project focused on the relational subject, the non-liberal agent of sovereign action, who is both distinct and inseparable from others. The third project explores conditions for today's global trends in authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Professor Feldman has also founded has been a pioneer in several initiatives. He had founded the Vancouver Society for the Promotion of the Liberal Arts and convened the Hannah Arendt Reading Group in Vancouver. Last but not the least, he co-founded the Interest Group for the Anthropology of Public Policy, which became the Association for the Anthropology of Policy within the American Anthropological Association, and which has been one of the fastest growing networks among the anthropologists. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Professor Feldman. We are very much looking forward to your very timely talk. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Aisha, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank Anna Chukovic for logistically arranging everything. I'll begin by acknowledging that the University of Windsor, my university, sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, and that includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. Right now I'm on sabbatical, and I'm living right across the street from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, which is located on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. So I do want to thank Aisha again for this introduction. I'm really honored to be able to speak to this audience today, and I hope you all find it worth your while. I was unsure if I had material to present, as my current ethnographic work on this Congolese political activism in Canada is still in kind of early and raw form. Relatedly, though, I'm finishing a book manuscript on sovereignty understood as a phenomenal relational experience of new beginnings. And this book is based on critiques of film, novels, philosophical tracts, and some ethnographic work that others have done. And in it, I argue that if human relationality is accepted as the basis of shared space, then politics becomes an experience of newness and possibilities. In contrast, if we retain the myth of the individualized bounded subject as the premise of sovereign space, and the Western state model, then dehumanization and foreclosure characterize the polity. So drawing on that work today, I explore, and I mean explore, and I consider this a conversation more than a lecture, explore how the figure of the migrant, to borrow Thomas Nail's phrase, figures into the tension between these fascist trends we see everywhere, these kind of neo-right trends, and the struggle for decolonization. So that's how I approached the invitation to speak to you today. Okay, let me just set my watch here so I know that I'm not going to talk to overtime. In an earlier and more radical version of himself, Salman Rushdie wrote a 1982 essay called The New Empire Within Britain. It remains just as relevant today as it did 40 years late, as it was 40 years ago. Following E.P. Thompson, he argues that Britain itself is the last colony of the British Empire. And he writes, quote, it sometimes seems that the British authorities, no longer capable of exporting governments, have chosen instead to import a new empire, a new community of subject peoples whom they think, and of whom they think and with whom they can deal in very much the same way as their predecessors thought of and dealt with the fluttered folk and wild, the new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child, who made up for Rudyard Kipling, the white man's burden, end quote. Now, Rushdie stresses that those peoples imported into the new empire are, of course, regarded as immigrants, and he puts the terms in quotes, even though nearly half were born on British soil at the time of writing in 1982. And while many of them are white, Rushdie, like the rest of us, knows that the term carries special meaning for peoples of color. And he explains, quote, still the word immigrant means black immigrant. The myth of swamping lingers on, and even British-born blacks and Asians are thought of as people whose real home is elsewhere. Immigration is a problem if you're worried about blacks. That is, if your whole approach to the question is one of racial prejudice, end quote. And this point pertains across the political spectrum. He says, if you're liberal, you say that black people have problems. If you aren't, you say they are the problem. Rushdie makes clear that many others have, that the quote, new members of the colony have only one real problem, and that problem is white people. British racism, of course, is not our problem, it's yours. We simply suffer the effects of your problem, end quote. So in my mind, Rushdie reveals how the struggles for decolonization and the struggles against white nationalism, a stepping stone to fascism, pivots on the figure of the migrants. The modern connotation of the term migrant only appears by the 19th century. Previously, it simply meant someone who traveled, like pilgrims, seasonal laborers, itinerant laborers, domestic servants, traders, or even exiles. It did not refer to a categorical other with a clean line between us and them. They might have been strangers, but they were not others, and the customs of hospitality would be available to them, as customs of hospitality exist around the world, or have existed around the world. How did this clean line form? How did this clean break occur between us and them? What convinced us, or we, those not in motion, what convinced us that we bore no relation to those who were in motion? The answer, I suspect, is found in a logically prior question. Specifically, what made any one of us, meaning good modern liberals, think that we have no relation to anyone other than ourselves? What made us think that each of us is self-made and unrelated to the historical sweep into which we are born? More succinctly, what made us believe in individualism? To be sure, the figure of the migrant appears long after the birth of the individualized liberal subject. And I think that ordering is important, right? We'll talk a little bit about that. This is hardly an abstract philosophical matter, but rather an immediately political one that cannot be separated from fascism, colonization, and the phenomenon of migranthood, the status of being in the position of someone without a homeland, or regarded as someone without one. None other than Frantz Fanon was acutely aware of the point. In his Wretched of the Earth, he famously calls for violence to break the chokehold of colonialism so that new possibilities of being might be realized for all humanity. But if you ask, at whom or at what is this violence to be directed, his first answer is actually much subtler than his otherwise poetic flair might suggest. And he writes, and this is on page 11 of the Grove Press edition of Wretched of the Earth, he writes, first among them is individualism. So one of the first targets of this violence is against individualism. the foundation of Western political order. Indeed, it was the colonial bourgeoisie that, quote, hammered into the colonized mind the notion of a society of individuals where each is locked in his own subjectivity, end quote. And I would add to that that the colonizers themselves had to hammer into their own minds the same point before they could encounter the colonized other, or manufacture or fabricate the colonized other. So in this talk, I wish to follow Fanon's thread to this individualized subject so that we can understand how it emerged, what work it has been doing to encourage fascism, also to create the migrant as fascism's foil, and why deconstructing it is so central to both decolonization and anti-fascism. Now, rather than survey the vast and ever-changing specialized literatures on these topics, trying to keep up with all the latest trends, I get at the matter by focusing on just a few pivotal writers who I think well capture the core issues at stake. I begin with Thomas Hobbes and Alexis de Tocqueville on the question of how the atomized, individualized subject of liberalism so easily swings between a selfish libertarianism and a frightening fascism that needs migrants, again in quotes, as its foil. I then turn to Frantz, Fanon, and James Baldwin, who articulate a diametrically opposed political subject. And that subject is a relational one, whose being unfolds in dialogue with others. And it's also an open-ended one, whose sense of new possibilities depends upon the uniqueness of its own existence. So you get this relationality and uniqueness in this other kind of non-liberal subject. And among such relational subjects, no one would be a migrant, and fascism would be unimaginable, theoretically speaking, anyway. Okay, so let's get going. What stands out in Hobbes' famous book, Leviathan, is not the security that a supposedly all-powerful sovereign monarch holds over its quarrelsome citizenry, but instead, what stands out is how fragile the whole sovereign edifice actually is. Rather than security, it offers man its precarity at best, because it is premised upon an ordinary, unremarkable, abstract, and entirely self-interested man, quote unquote, not an all-powerful king. The whole focus is on the man, not the king or the monarch. Hobbes dedicates roughly 25% of Leviathan to man, in quotes. And I'm going to use the gendered language because I want to locate the historical particularity of the idea. So I'll keep using that as Hobbes did. The man to whom we are introduced just takes up a quarter of the whole huge book. He just explains this thing in detail. The man to whom we are introduced does not hold any particular social position or rank. He does not descend from any particular lineage. He is not associated with any particular English city or town or hamlet. In other words, Hobbes' man is not a social, political, or even a historical being in the world. Appearing from nowhere, he is instead a resolutely self-centered natural being. And he would be fundamentally the same wherever he appeared on Earth. He is a specimen identical to all others of the human species who wavers between his drive for individual self-fulfillment and the need for protection by blending in with the mass of society. This timeless man, as we know, emerges in a mythical state of nature, which I personally doubt Hobbes actually believed in. Instead, it seems to me that the state of nature that he talks about in the beginning there functions as a mythology to legitimize the emergence of a new competitive and defensive bourgeois subject that will become the foundation of modern society and economy, the very subject that Fanon wants to dispense of. With the state of nature, Hobbes does not look to the past to explain the woes of the English Civil War occurring at the time of writing in 1651, but rather he looks squarely into the future, fully aware of the unhappy world that was materializing before his eyes. And Hobbes' man is fully a materialist being. Each person is an entity unto itself with its own radically subjective standpoint. For Hobbes, all people are, on balance, naturally equal in body and mind. The weakest can still kill the strongest through cleverness and aided by allies, and life experience levels out people's mental aptitudes over time. Given this radical equality of persons, their radically subjective standpoints, in the absence of a divine goodness as a common standard of living together, what gets identified as good, evil, or contemptible only holds true in relation to the person making the call. And if that person be a judge authorized by common consent, then the judge's call becomes the rule to follow. This solitary and self-contained natural man possesses a fundamental right. It's the basis of the whole edifice that Hobbes creates. And that fundamental right premises the laws of nature, which in turn premises the laws of sovereignty. Hobbes explains that, quote, the right of nature is the liberty each man hath to use his own power as he himself wills, for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which, in its own judgment and reason, he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto, end quote. So what Hobbes is doing is he's not only validating self-defense, which is understandable enough, but he also grants this man, this subject, grants him full leeway in deciding what signifies a threat to one's life and what amounts to an appropriate response. From this natural right, two laws of nature derive. First, that everyone should seek peace as the surest path to their own preservation. And second, that everyone should renounce the same amount of liberty, for life under sovereign authority, so that no single person has any more than another. This mutual security is achieved, as we know, by transferring liberties to a sovereign who in turn guarantees the protection of all subjects. And here, with Hobbes, the idea of the homogeneous mass is introduced into Western political philosophy, and it will soon become, if not already, the basis of Western political practice. Part 2 of Leviathan then outlines a commonwealth ruled by a sovereign who, quote, may reduce all people's wills by plurality of voices unto one will, end quote. And Hobbes' Leviathan here pushes much deeper than the term social contract suggests. And we're always calling Hobbes and others, they call them social contract theorists. But even Hobbes finds that term too timid and too restrained. Hobbes explains, quote, that this is more than consent or concord. It is the real unity of them all in one and the same person, made by covenant of every man with every man in such a manner that if every man should say to every man, I authorize and give up my right to govern myself to this man, this sovereign, or to this assembly of men, on this condition that thou give up thy right to him as well, and authorize all his actions in like manner, end quote. So, I mean, that's powerful stuff. And we kind of know this, of course, about Hobbes. It's not a great breakthrough to quote this, but just to let it sink in for a second, because Hobbes articulates here the odd phenomenon of equality, of mass equality without freedom, a phenomenon that still plagues, and a dilemma that still plagues traditional Western understandings of politics, is how to reconcile equality and freedom. Okay, but remember the right of nature that we mentioned. The sovereign subjects have license to abandon the sovereign if it jeopardizes their ability to preserve their own lives. And Hobbes lists those situations as being commanded to kill oneself. You don't have to do that. Or being commanded not to resist those who would do us harm, and to abstain from incorporating the vital necessities of life, such as food, air, and medicine. That's precisely the things he lists. And that last reason expands the matter from politics into economy, that a threat to your life you can see in economic terms as much as political ones. Furthermore, once the subject is unable to protect the subject, then the subject is no longer bound to the sovereign's will. Hobbes seems to reserve that prospect for times of war, but given the other qualifications on sovereign power, he leaves room for broad interpretation as to what protection entails. Indeed, this whole arrangement creates a slippery slope, as it leaves much room for resistance, rebellion, and sedition. The banished, the enslaved, the poor, meaning just the propertyless in the 17th century, the criminal, and foreigners can all derive an argument from Hobbes' rendition of natural law and natural right to legitimately attack sovereign authority for its failure to protect them, and thus become their own self-sovereign. Now, this prerogative, of course, should raise not much suspicion in an age of democracy. We're all for the people, right? But with Hobbes, we get the articulation of the radically individualized subjects as both terrified of all other people and likewise prone to mass conformity in the sacrifice of individual perspective. That's the flip side of all this. The citizen can act as either libertarians, individuals who think of themselves as unbound by law or custom, or as popular vigilantes, groups of self-same individuals taking justice into their own hands on the claim that the state refuses to protect them. This conformity requires the presence of essentialized others, against which to define itself. At the same time, the subject's ability to push back against sovereign authority and establish their own sovereignty creates an ongoing tension between the formal state and the people, as each can justify their actions through natural law. The people become an undifferentiated whole, whose differences with other such wholes are absolute. Those others may be located within the sovereign's territory, the immigrant, the refugee, the poor, the enslaved. It may be located beyond the territory, the enemy sovereign and its subjects, or it could be somewhere in between, the indigenous and colonized lands. And he does speak of indigenous peoples a little bit in Leviathan. In all cases, however, pluralities are abstracted into mythically homogenous groups. In Civil War England in the 1650s, it's Protestants and Catholics, but you can put in any essentialized group you like. So therefore, even though Hobbes shows no concern for race, it's not really on his agenda as we think of it today, he prepared the soil for racist ideologies by distinguishing essentialized groups from the sovereign and gradating their respective distances from the heart of the political community. And I borrow that insight from Hannah Arendt. In so doing, he lays the foundation for mass conformity as the basis of an anti-royalist sovereign order that will further be developed by Rousseau and actualized in the French Revolution, which had its own problems with essentialization, as we know. Yet it was another Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, who clearly recognized the dangers of a sovereignty expressed through a mass singular will. Tocqueville was interested in why France fell back on monarchy after its revolution and what might be the consequences if it returned to democracy. Though broadly supportive of the American experiments, Democracy in America, written in 1835, is filled with warnings about the fickleness and ferocity of mass politics and how it can quickly lead to the famous tyranny of the majority that he talks about. And this tyranny certainly resembles what we today call fascism, as it crushes minority opposition, eliminates dissenting opinion, disciplines and homogenizes the titular nation, assumes a hostile attitude towards the state, and potentially rallies the majority around a charismatic leader. Tocqueville examined the real-world manifestations of Hobbes' insight that modern bourgeois society creates a binary opposition between the atomized individual and the mass. For Tocqueville, because, quote, the human heart nourishes a debased taste for equality, end quote, and we can talk about that quote later, mass democracy is left without, quote, a middle course between the sovereignty of all and the absolute power of one man, end quote. Moreover, the tyranny of the majority blends both poles, the all and the one man, into a single form of action, greatly resembling fascism. For the sovereignty of all, the belief prevails that the majority holds greater wisdom and thus moral authority simply because of the greater numbers. It does not matter how fleeting or fickle their opinion might be. If the majority says it, then it is correct, even if it contradicted what it said yesterday. Tocqueville perceives in American democracy that the practices of governing institutions, state institutions, cannot withstand the tyranny of the majority when its voice becomes loud and fierce enough. These institutions are ostensibly, they're intended, right, to stabilize a diverse society and protect it from the whims of popular opinion. But Tocqueville reasons with us accordingly. He writes, quote, when a man or a party suffers an injustice in the United States, to whom can he turn? To public opinion? This is what forms the majority. To the legislative body, it represents the majority and obeys it blindly. To the executive power, it is appointed by the majority and serves as its passive instrument. To the police, they are nothing but the majority under arms. To a jury, the jury is the majority invested with the right to pronounce judgment. Even judges in certain states are elected by the majority. So however iniquitous or unreasonable the measure which hurts you, you must submit, end quote. And per the one man, this power of majority opinion easily leads to vigilante justice by fusing the homogenized people into a singular unrestrained voice, best expressed through what we today call a charismatic leader. Tocqueville thus fears democracy, not because, quote, the extreme freedom reigning there, but because of the shortage of guarantees against tyranny, end quote. Tocqueville cleverly concludes that, speaking for him, I will not grant the several that power to everything which I refuse a single man. Okay, now, Tocqueville shows us that liberal societies are fully capable of becoming what Viktor Orban famously and ironically calls illiberal democracy, a stepping stone to fascism. These can lead to cults of personality, whether in the 20th century, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, or Mao, take your pick, or the 21st, from President Trump's Make America Great Again movement, to Putin's tiresome displays of Russian machismo, to the leader for life aspiration of China's President Xi Jinping, and to Turkey's Recep Erdogan. These cults similarly deploy, as we know, essentialist notions of racial and national purity, supposedly under assault from minorities, social outcasts, political opposition, and as always, migrants. All of this recalls Hermann Göring's unsettling insight into the totalitarian tendencies of modern mass society in general, right? And here he's speaking to a US psychologist while he's he's in prison awaiting his trial in Nuremberg after the war. Göring writes, quote, naturally, the common people don't want war. But after all, it's the leaders of a country who determine the policy. And it's always a simple matter to drag people along, whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to do the bidding of the leaders. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked, denounce the pacifists for their lack of patriotism and for exposing the country to danger. It works the same in every country, end quote. Now, the prospects of all this, and it's pretty harrowing, of course, was already present in Leviathan, written 300 years earlier. And it's obvious enough how this situation oppresses those identified as threatening, the opposition, the other, the migrants. No less important, however, and far less examined, is how this situation corrupts, degrades, and dehumanizes the oppressor, even while they retain their position of privilege and structural superiority. In his famous essay, The Intimate Enemy, Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism, Ashish Nandy explains the subtle reason why we should support the slave in the struggle between the slave and the master. And a lengthy quote is warranted. He says, one must choose the slave, not because one should choose voluntary poverty or admit the superiority of suffering. One not only because a slave is oppressed. One must choose the slave because he represents a higher order cognition, which perforce includes the master as a human, whereas the master's cognition has to exclude the slave except as a thing. Ultimately, modern oppression, as opposed to traditional oppression, is not an encounter between the self and the enemy, the rulers and the ruled, or the gods and the demons. Modern oppression is a battle between dehumanized self and objectified enemy, the technologized bureaucrats and his reified victim, pseudo-rulers and their fearsome other selves projected onto their subjects, end quote. So Nandi here, with this observation, contradicts the premise of Western liberal political understanding. He is arguing that we are not simply individualized entities, but instead we each make each other through the relationships in which we are suspended, but yet to deny that relationality, to act as if we were really discrete entities, is to violate both the self and the other. And if those two encounter each other in a relationship of inequality, then the act of oppressing the other will lead the self to a dangerous nihilism and self-destruction. Hence, in the context of the French in the Caribbean, Aimé Césaire forthrightly explains that the colonizer insists on, quote, seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and then tends objectively to transform himself into an animal, end quote. And in the context of anti-Semitism in the network of Nazi concentration camps, Hannah Arendt similarly concludes that, quote, the manipulators of this system believe in their own superfluousness as much as in that of all others. The totalitarian murderers are all the more dangerous because they do not care if they themselves are alive or dead, if they ever lived or never were born, end quote. Therefore, an emancipatory politics must also convey how oppression destroys the oppressors. In denying their relationality to the oppressed, they proceed through life as if they are Hobbes's radically subjective individuals, unaware of how they destroy both themselves and the proverbial other. No wonder Fanon made individualism the first target of his violence. It makes everyone lose. Okay, so from here, I will not address the question of violence in Fanon, but rather how Fanon sets up the problematic of colonization and the other, and its solution in terms of an alternative to the individualized subject. In Black Skin, White Masks, he argues that, quote, both the black man, slave to his inferiority, and the white man, slave to his superiority, behave along neurotic lines. And he locates this inferiority complex afflicting this colonized subject, firstly in economic inequalities, and then in the, quote, internalization, or rather epidermalization of this inferiority, end quote. This situation creates a vicious cycle in which whites regard themselves as superior to blacks, and blacks want to, quote, prove at all costs to the whites that the wealth of the black man's intellect wants to prove the wealth of the black man's intellect and equal intelligence, end quote. A situation arises in which, as Fanon says, the black man wants to be white, and the white man is desperately trying to achieve the rank of man, end quote. Remember, he is animal, as per Césaire. He therefore aims to destroy, Fanon, this whole entire massive, what he calls the psycho-existential complex, for the sake of his brother, black or white. For Fanon, racialized categories prevent us from negotiating with each other as particular persons, rather than representatives of homogenized racialized categories. He denies that blackness can serve as a premise for action. He writes, running the risk of angering my black brothers, I shall say that a black is not a man, end quote. Recognition of this point for Fanon is the prerequisite for the black man to liberate himself from himself, or in other words, from the alienating effects of, quote, the arsenal of complexes that germinated in a colonial situation. And this is important because the past is not determinative for Fanon, so he implores the black man and the white man to, quote, move away from the inhuman voice of their respective ancestors so that a genuine communication can be born. So overcoming that situation begins with the recognition that the past does not make someone a finished product, as he just implied in that previous quote. And for this reason, Fanon insists in a debate with traditional Marxists that he says, I am not a prisoner of history, because traditional Marxism has history pushing us forward behind our backs, as if the subject is but an effect. And he says, I'm not a prisoner of history, and that, quote, the real leap consists of introducing invention into life, end quote. And indeed, if invention is central to human lives, then the past can never be fully determinative of the present. The unexpected is always possible. Fanon reaches that position after criticizing Jean-Paul Sartre in an earlier chapter for evacuating people of their impulsiveness, by which he means their creativity and their spontaneity. When he criticizes that when Sartre argues that negritude is merely a stage in a historical dialectical progression that will ultimately synthesize with white supremacy to create a society without race, right? So there's this historical inevitability in Sartre's thinking. In reply, Fanon argues that, quote, such a dialectic that introduces necessity as a support for my freedom, meaning historical necessity as a support for my freedom, expels me from myself. I am not a potentiality of something. I fully am what I am, end quote. Fanon sees instead himself and anyone else as an entity with infinite possibility, with, quote, my soul as vast as the world. Truly a soul as deep as the deepest rivers, and my chest has the power to expand to infinity, end quote. So what you're seeing in Fanon here is both somebody who's distinctly individual and unique, and this almost sounds liberal if you stop it there, but someone whose being is always bound up in relationality. And to overcome the inferiority and the distortions we have of ourselves, we need to jettison this colonial psycho-existential complex. Now, while in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon outlines a relational subject of politics, he puts that subject into action in Wretched of the Earth. Fanon calls out, quote, for Europe and for ourselves and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man, end quote. Fanon identifies the requisite liberatory force not in the workers, but in the lumpen proletariat of the colonized world. Of course, he borrows a term from Marx to describe the assorted others living so far out of the system of production that they lack a revolutionary class conscience. However, for Fanon, he regards them as the initiators of anti-colonial revolution, precisely because they are not conditioned by any Western conception of political subjecthood, unlike the European working class. For him, the lumpen proletariat are a genuine plurality, consisting mainly of the rural peasantry, along with others living in the margins of the colonial capitalist economy. Their actions, according to Fanon, or he hopes, do not seek to create a world based on a mythological pre-colonial culture. That culture has largely been fabricated by the colonialist and the colonized intellectual, in Fanon's terminology. Instead, it should emerge from the present day in situ struggles that look forward to a better future in the form of a new national culture, which he discusses at the end of Wretched of the Earth. In my own view, Fanon's idea of national culture is a bit unclear. So I also question to the extent to which it realizes the relational subject that he so brilliantly outlined in Black Skin, White Masks. I won't go into it here, but most important is how Fanon composes his political subject of action. This is not an individualized, bounded liberal subject, of course. Instead, that subject's interior, its blackness or whiteness, or its own self-perception as black or white, is inseparable from the larger psycho-existential complex of colonialism. But at the same time, neither is the subject reducible to that complex. Fanon fervently believes it is unique and has unlimited potential. And presumably we all have chests with the power to expand to infinity, to borrow his phrase. In short, he presents a relational subject who is both utterly unique and inherently related to all others, who becomes who he is or she is through their relations. This subject is not radically subjective in its outlook, like Hobbes' natural man, but rather it is intersubjective. Okay, so from here, I want to pivot to James Baldwin to further develop this relational subject. Though certainly realized in the context of racial oppression in the US, his autobiographical tale is accessible to anyone who struggled to live authentically, use the term as Heidegger would use it, as resonating with yourself and those around you. Baldwin describes this struggle as both interior and exterior to the self. It's interior, you'll see the similarities to Fanon, is interior insofar as we are internally divided between what history tells us we are and how we tell our own story to ourselves, given the uniqueness of our birth. So we're divided there internally because of that dilemma. And exterior as well, insofar as we must create an audience with whom we can constitute ourselves in mutual dialogue, just as those others are constituting themselves in dialogue with us. So the interior, the exterior is dynamic and not totally separated, related and different at the same time. Baldwin writes that in trying to discover himself, he realized, quote, there was certainly between that self and me that the accumulated rock of ages. This rock scarred the hand while all tools broke against it, end quote. Yet he felt deeply that somewhere near the rock was himself, his salvation, his identity, but only if he could first, quote, decipher and describe the rock, end quote. That rock signified his inheritance. This is the term he uses. The rock signifies his inheritance, which he distinguishes from his birthright. For Baldwin to claim his birthright, he necessarily had to challenge and claim the rock, lest the rock claim him. That is, define him and forever tie him to the social position into which he was born and with the social expectations that come with it. An extended quote is warranted from Baldwin. He says, or to put it another way, my inheritance was particular, specifically limited and limiting. My birthright was vast, connecting me to all that lives and to everyone forever. But one cannot claim the birthright without accepting the inheritance. Therefore, when I began to seriously to write, when I knew I was committed, that this would be my life, I had to try to describe the particular situation, the particular condition, which is the living proof of my inheritance. And at the same time, with that very same description, I had to claim my birthright. I am what time, circumstance, history have made of me, certainly, but I am also much more than that. So are we all, end quote. So Baldwin's inheritance is his location in a field of human relations that conditioned his particular life chances, being Black and gay in mid-20th century United States. He arrived from birth enmeshed in that relational field, and yet recognized it as distinct from himself. Therefore, conditions are not determinants. They are the cards we are dealt. We can play them with as much wit and creativity as we can muster from where we stand. And for this reason, Baldwin says he is much more than his inheritance. He is also his birthright expressed through his creative actions, that is, in his case, his writings, through which he constitutes both himself and consequently redefines the inheritance that he shares with others, that history that he was born into and was going to condition him unless he recognized his birthright. The need to reconstitute himself meant that the rock of his inheritance had created a split within him, between, as he put it, between that self and me. So this is no internally coherent, bounded, individualized liberal subject. The subject is split into two voices between me and myself that strive to reach a kind of inner agreement with itself as to how it could live as a singular entity with the world that he has inherited. And part of that I also borrow from Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind, that formulation, that we have an internal dialogue about how we can live at peace with ourselves based on how we live in the world with others. Can we reconcile those two together? That's what the struggle of this relational subject is. If that split internally did not happen, then Baldwin, like anyone, would have recognized no difference between the rock and himself. He would have dutifully fulfilled the social role that history prescribed to him at birth. Of course, he did not. He would not have been conscious of his own distinct existence. Baldwin sees the potential to exceed one's inheritance as a shared feature of humanity. And this is why he wrote, as I said, I am also much more than that, so are we all, end quote. Okay, so to wrap it up here, Fanon and Baldwin allow us to see past the myth of the individualized liberal subject and to recognize the reality of people as mutually constituting subjects. To premise an emancipatory politics on such subjects, we must first recognize how fascism and colonialism have eradicated, in a sense, this is a sweeping statement, but there's something to it, have eradicated the personhood of everyone with the 17th century mythology of the individualized subject. That myth has led us to a politics based on a false choice between isolated and terrified individuals and the sovereign tyranny of an illiberal, homogenized majority. In contrast, through Baldwin and Fanon, we learn how the subject's internal divisions between its history, its inheritance, and its potentiality, its birthright, render it a unique, creative, and constituent actor in a plural world. This internal division leaves the subject open-ended and capable of pushing history in new directions through its joint actions with other such open-ended subjects. Here we encounter a sovereignty of newness and relationality, in which no one could be a migrant because each person being depends upon the recognition of the other. Lest we accept fascism, colonization, and migranthood as eternal givens, we must build a politics upon this relational subject of sovereignty. And I shall leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg, for this kind of a grand tour through the pillars of the political philosophy, but also the questions that come up, who is so central to the debates of that, the decolonization, and in terms of the quote unquote liberation by Fanon. I would give the floor to the questions, but before that, let me ask you one question. As far as I understand, is that what you're arguing is that the being political is very much dependent on the realization of relationality of the individuals beyond that kind of the dilemma of that isolation, or that within the what you call that the sovereignty of the illiberal, kind of the sovereignty of the masses in a way. And what you are in a way turning around is that the way that you started with Salman Rushdie is that actually the decolonization could not be reduced to the question of the freedom of the decolonized, but looking at from the perspective, as long as it does not made own of the oppressor or the colonizer, then there could not be a kind of a decolonization. So it is not only from the perspective of the suppressed with the oppressed, but it is the question of the oppressor and the white to be able to realize its own relationality. Otherwise, it is the humanizing aspect. And then where I see there is that this is very much related with the kind of the force of the history, but the potentiality that you're talking about, so that there is an openness. So it is not a kind of the history determinist kind of an history. So I think this is important in terms of the political alliances, the questions about the political alliances, and whose problem it should be. that the question of even the decolonization, it could never be only the problem of decolonized, but also the decolonizer. In relation to the to Fanon, I have one question in terms of that, which you went over very quickly towards the end, in terms of the kind of the national culture or the idea of community that in Fanon. I'm just referring to the very recent article that Anthony Appiah had written on Frantz Fanon. I don't know whether you had seen it, that where the Fanon had always, in a way, opted for the kind of, no matter how critical he was, but opted with the kind of the quote unquote communitarian and then the traditional kinds of the cultures, that what you were referring as the national culture, that where there is that kind of an ambivalence. Maybe you could open that one. The second question is that if we follow this kind of the thought that the being political is really dependent on understanding then the relationality for both, for everyone, actually from all parts of the political spectrum. If we follow yours, for that the where the attempts or struggles for decolonization should be addressed to, that it is because it, I feel like that it entails a political agenda in the way that you are, or quote unquote, and an agenda. It is not a political action, but it opens the field of the decolonization to a very different kinds of alliances or different kinds of questions. So how would it really look like from this perspective, the decolonization attempt? This is and then afterwards I would leave the floor to the others to pose their questions. So these are the kind of starting questions.
Okay, well, thank you for that good summary of my talk, and made it even clearer to myself, so I appreciate that. And the questions there. Fanon on national culture, he says right after this quote about individualism being the first target of violence, he says this is to be replaced with village assemblies and local committees and negotiating individual interest into collective programs or something like this. And what that sounds to me like is forms of direct democracy where people organize themselves and it's not representative. We're not there being representative. That's the way that particular paragraph reads to me. When he gets to the end on national culture, I think you could sort of look at it both ways, and I think there's lots of room to keep developing what he's writing, and Fanon experts certainly have. I do want to say I don't consider myself a Fanon expert. I basically just read the books, and I'm taking from them what I see in his own text. I'm not trying to engage all the specialists out there. But on the one hand, he says things like there's certain kinds of crafts and things that constitute this new culture. He mentions like pottery, I think, and he's very kind of specific about a few things that people do that have their kind of politics of the moment worked into the art, and that those art forms don't rely on abstract forms, right? He says something to this effect, and I'm getting that interpretation. I want to make sure I cite people from Professor Robsis, who is somewhere in New York, I'm not sure. Um, um, so there's this kind of idea that culture doesn't, I mean, you know, culture meaning artifacts and manufacturing and creative aesthetics and this kind of thing. It doesn't follow form. So it's not being dictated by a certain hegemonic or aesthetic ideal. So it's organic to the people doing them. So then you can see how you can imagine people flourishing as a plurality and working off of each other and not just imitating grand masters or something. But at the same time, I kind of wonder why he uses this term national culture, which is so loaded with all the problems we're trying to overcome. So, I mean, I don't have an answer for that. I don't feel like I need to find one either, because I think the subject, as he lays it out in Black Skin, White Masks, is so compelling that you can, you know, you can start to develop a kind of relational politics out of Black Skin, White Masks alone, almost. And what he's writing in Wretched of the Earth is much more, it's much more immediate. It's how do you, you know, it's Algeria, it's France. How do you overthrow someone who's occupying your lands? And I think that immediacy, it kind of overrides the deeper implications of political possibility that I think anyway you get in Black Skin, White Masks. So I don't feel a deep need to try to explain what he means by national culture. Plenty of other people are engaged in that. But just to sort of, you know, he puts it out there though, and I just want to recognize that and move forward from more so from Black Skin, White Masks. That's, you know, that's kind of how I take it anyway. The second question is, where should the struggle for decolonization take place and the different alliances that will form? You know, I should first start by saying that A, I'm a white guy, as you can tell, and B, my ethnographic expertise, you know, if I can claim that title, has always been in Europe. So, you know, far be it from me to say where the struggles should happen. But I think the point of this relational subject is that you come into your own through your engagements with the people around you, and that historical field and that inheritance, as Baldwin puts it. And that looks different for each person and each people who are looking at each other. And it has to come out of whatever people's struggles are, wherever they are. But the key thing is to recognize that a person is both distinct, which left alone sounds liberal, but also relational. And that my being and your being are tied together. And that means that our being occupies a space between us. And therefore, that space then becomes political space. It becomes public space. So being in politics can't be separated, which is not a kind of liberal thing to say at all. So I think it's that awareness. And I would go ahead and say that awareness of that fact of relationality that will define what the struggles are wherever people are located. That's I think the only answer I can really give to that.
Okay, thank you very much. I find it very important, actually, the point that you're bringing up, that the decolonization is in a way becomes, or very often thought to be and discussed as the problem of the colonized. And and then this changes, and then this is where actually I think you made the connections with the migrant, that it is whose problem is that, and that you cannot, it is not the question of the emancipation of the oppressed, but it is, there could never be a kind of an emancipation for anyone if it would not be seen as the relational and made their own of those who are the oppressors in a way. So that I think has an important, very important part of it, because part of the agenda, actually, it's a very important political beginning point, I think. So I would just now open the floor. I see that Ranabir is turning the video on. Ranabir, would you like to pose a question?
No, no. I listened with attention. I don't have any question.
Okay, okay. So let me see whether there are any questions coming from the audience. Let me see.
Will the record be available, Aisha?
Sorry?
Will the record be available?
Yes, it would be available. It is available.
Okay, and if Professor Feldman has any writing on it, because the theme is very interesting for me, then I would like to read it. If there is any publication on this, I would be very happy to read it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure he could share it with you. Or I think this is in the making, but of course, the Professor Feldman's other kinds of writings are available. Only this one that I have not seen anything yet, but I think he might share it with you directly after.
Just please
After.
pass on my email ID to him. That should be.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm just asking, trying to see whether there are any other questions. That seems to be no questions. Oh, sorry, Claire Doherty. Maybe you want to pose your own question, or yes. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much for a really, really interesting presentation. And it took me on a long journey right back to my days of doing my bachelor in social science. But thank you for that. It was really, really interesting and very insightful. I was particularly taken by your analogy about liberal democracies, how democracy can actually in itself, in a liberal democracy, be quite restrictive and actually denying someone their human potential. But my question, and I really take your point about the idea about relational qualities, but my question I'm coming from background in social policy. So my question is then, how do you take that analysis and how do you deconstruct the idea of liberal democracy and embrace what you're proposing because it strikes me that I know you mentioned about doing it through civic action, but in terms of a political agenda, how do you embed that in a type of political agenda? I know that's a huge question.
No, it's an important question. I mean, it seems to me that policymaking, in many ways, is kind of constantly surveying what people are always doing, and they're kind of looking for trends. And then they have, this is a general statement too, and so they're sort of looking for trends, and then they kind of abstract those trends out and somehow put them in a policy to legitimize the policy. Policy doesn't just spring out of the heads of the policymaker. They're kind of trying to read the tea leaves all the time. But in that process of abstracting out, it sort of evacuates local initiative in a way to try to manage it towards whatever ends the state has in mind or whatever ends government has in mind. So in a way, there already is a dialogue between policy and people. It's just a very lopsided dialogue. The more an ethic is developed that lets those local expressions have more control over that dialogue, the more you can incorporate it. Now, that's not very specific, but I really can't give specific advice. But it really is a kind of balance of power, right? And this isn't to say that policymakers are power grubby, they're hoarding power, but it's sort of in the nature of the work is that policymakers have a lot of power. They can define and they can shape and they can write. And they tend to abstract from local initiative to legitimize it. But if you could equalize that discussion more, then you're on your way to doing that. That, however, would seem to me to require a much more localized form of government too. But you know, there's probably examples out there that just have to be found somewhere. But it's balancing the power in that conversation is what I would think.
Yeah, because your presentation reminded me somewhat of Iris Marion Young's model of deliberative democracy in terms of looking at political equality, inclusion, how we reach consensus, etc. So yeah, it was really insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions that, I mean, you don't have to write it on the chat. You could just raise your hand and then we could, Dorothy, did you raise your hand again or just it's the old hand? Okay, I think it is the old hand. But I mean, in a way that what you were suggesting is it is the kind of the very old Marxian dilemma that I have that you're bringing up in terms of that beyond that the determinism, but also in terms of that the relationality. How could you conceptualize the relationality and then recognize the power of the past, but without being any kind of the determinism? But I think we have Olga Bizikova. She's asking, or if you want to pose yourself the question, Olga, go ahead. You're muted.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My question was basically about also the subject of emancipation. If we abandon individual as a notion of, as a political category and the category of political struggle, does it, so then in whose name emancipation, or who is emancipated? And does it mean that we go back or go for to the categories of nation? Or national struggle, because for Fanon, as I think Professor Chaglar also mentioned it, he very much still operated within these categories of national struggle, national state as emancipatory. So does it mean that then we should go to collectivist or communitarian categories as political categories? Thank you.
Thank you. That's one of the key questions here. I think no, it's not a collect. The alternative to the individual is not the collective, because that remains within the problem of the bounded subject that we get with liberalism. That's why you can go from this radical individual to the mass. The mass is also a bounded subject, right? With an eternal definition to it and incapable of change and this kind of thing. So this is why Marxism doesn't really have an answer to this dilemma, because it looks at class as the category. It has to be, it's the individual along with a principle of organization that the people who adopt that principle are also empowered to change. Okay, because it is very much, it is the individual who struggles. James Baldwin is struggling against the rock that scars his hand when he writes, right? We all struggle, and we struggle to reach that inner agreement so that the way that we conduct ourselves in the world allows us to live at peace with ourselves. So it initiates, our struggles initiates from that dilemma. But I hate to use the word because it's such an awful word just to say, is intersubjective, right? It just doesn't resonate very well. But the idea that it's the relationships themselves that we are preserving, and there isn't a catchy way to say that. Is it collective? Is it individual? But it is sort of mutually constituting. And it's not asking us to deny our individuality. It's asking us to really rise up and be our individual selves. right? Look, if you think about people like, just take Baldwin and Fanon, what they had to do to make their contributions, they had to resolutely be themselves, but they're not denying connection. The reality of their person is always, again, it's relational. So all I can say is that we're talking about relational subjects, and that's not an easy thing to sort of put your mind around. It's not collective and it's not individual. How did you ask the question? In whose name are we being emancipated? Well, I mean, we're emancipating ourselves as a kind of group in solidarity, and we may even use racialized categories to do that, or we may use class or gender categories. What the difference is those categories are not defining us. We are defining the category, and when it's time to change that definition, we will, and we'll do it through our own sort of means. So the solidarity is essential, is as long as the definition doesn't control us. Because once it controls the actor is void of all agency, right? Unless the actor is happy to go along with it, that's one thing. But it can't be ideological, right? It can't be unchallenged. That's the main point. So it's a kind of a sloppy answer I have to give you, but I think that's just the nature of it. So does that satisfy me?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. But still, if I may, a short follow-up, but doesn't then, and it requires also certain universality, and that solidarity also requires a certain universal project, that in a way to accommodate particularity and plurality, we also need a notion of universality
Well, I'm not sure I would put it in those terms. I mean, I think I would say it requires a universal understanding that we're mutually constitutive, that you and I make each other, and this is what people do, but it's not universal in the sense of singular, right? It's not universal in the sense of inevitable or anything like that. It's universal in the sense that we have an understanding that we're mutually constituting beings. Put it like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It is a very optimistic note. So, I mean, it is good that in that sense, but we have another question from Nozi Louis Ozoma from University of Nigeria. For Fanon, decolonization cannot be achieved without violent struggle. If the disintegration of USSR is decolonization, it was not violently done, or do you think the violence was not visible? Could you make some comment in relation to that?
Yeah, well, again, my read on Fanon, and I keep jumping out of saying who was not somebody I consider myself expert on. I just simply read the books a couple of times. Is, you can look at violence the way he says it in many different ways, and it doesn't necessarily have to be physical violence against the body. I think at some point somewhere, he says something to the effect that it's this whole sort of colonial complex that occupies the person inside and outside that needs to be dismantled. And you can regard that, broadly speaking, as violent resistance, but that doesn't even necessarily have to include attacking a body. I guess there's parts of Fanon where he says it does. I'm not exactly sure. But I think, to take Fanon and keep him alive outside of the years that he was writing, you have to have a more flexible understanding of violence, because he's so deeply informed by Algeria, the Algerian, France and Algeria. So that immediacy of violence is very palpable and understandably so. But I don't think that this means that all overcoming of colonization or an effect of colonization means that we have to go attack bodies. But we do have to attack core ideas, which is why he starts the whole book with individualism. To me, I just thought that was almost a letdown. You get so much taken away by his flair, that rhetorical flair that he has. And then he says individualism, and I'm really like, what? You know, what's so glamorous about fighting individualism? Right? But then, you know, you see the logic of the whole thing, and that you could argue is what he sees as the essence of colonization, is the idea of individualism. So I don't think violence in the traditional understanding is a requisite. You never know where violence is going to lead. It seems like it will have the answer you want, but it opens up a can of worms that you don't know what the result will be. Was the dissolution of the USSR nonviolent? For the most part. For the most part, but that doesn't mean it wasn't some physical violence. The fact that it was nonviolent, there's relatively nonviolent. There's an important point about that, is that a lot of major structural changes actually happen through internal means initiated by people in power, right? So what disravels the Soviet Union is glasnost and perestroika. These are policy changes that came from the top. This then, of course, opened up a raft of movements on the ground that pushed the whole thing forward. But it's important to understand how that interplay between local and people in the positions of authority works. And if you can get them on your side, then you have a great advantage in avoiding violence. I mean, one of the great scenes, right, in Moscow in 1990 is Boris Yeltsin standing on top of a tank, and he says to the tank driver, "Are you with us?" And the tank driver comes out, and instead of firing on the crowd, he says, "I'm with you," right? So, it's amazing how quickly something can change and how peacefully in many cases. So I would be thinking openly and creatively on the question of violence.
So that I'm not equating in a way that if there were no violence, then there could not be real change of power. So
I would be thinking about that. Violence is actually a sign of weakness, you could say. If you have power and legitimacy, you don't need violence, right? And that power and violence aren't necessarily the same thing, right? So, there's lots of ways to look at it.
Okay, this is I think we're almost up in our time, but are there any others who would like to pose a question? Okay, if not, then let me thank you, Greg, for this very interesting talk, and then very intriguing talk, actually, in terms of which also goes, have you conceptualized the individual and then the relations, which I know have been bothering you for a long time in all your work, in a way, that relationality. So then it goes really at the heart of many of the questions that we are struggling with, be in relation to fascism or the decolonization, or dealing with the question or the figure of what the figure of migrant is, and where that threat or non-threat should be located in that. So thank you very much, and we are very much looking forward to see the written version of it, that hopefully it is coming, and maybe you could share with us later on once it is out. Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much for Greg for this interesting talk, and have a nice day or evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.